Hi everyone, it's good to be here and talk to you today. Thanks, Mike. Sam's comment is an interesting one. If you own the world, I guess we need to think about what to do with it, or how responsible we're going to be for it. And so that raises some pretty fundamental questions that sit at the heart of what managing reputation risk is all about. And so I'm going to try and give some context on some of the drivers we're seeing internationally that are shifting how you might think about reputation, and what I would call a pervasive change in the way that funds will need to operate and, in fact, will be scrutinised. So I'm going to cover what we're seeing is a group of changes or a trend around policy task forces, regulatory change, some developments we're seeing in normative ways, like at an organisation like PRI, and also talk about international institutions and what we're seeing shift as a context for reputation, and then talk about some of the ways that we're working with funds to help with these changes. So I've just put up a quick slide there. This is an example of one of the policy change processes that are going on globally. Now, it is tempting to say, those Europeans, they really like to think about sustainability and social compact in a different way, and this is not necessarily something we're going to see in other markets in the world. But I've described the high-level expert group on sustainable finance here in one slide, and this is one of 7 or 8 similar efforts in different countries. So there's the EU one, there's the UK Green Finance Task Force, there's the Chinese Greening the Financial System reforms, there's the Canadian High-Level Expert Group on Sustainable Finance, there's a Hong Kong Green Finance effort, the Norwegians have a Climate Economy Transformation Advisory Board, and as you may know, several funds and insurers in Australia have launched an effort from industry to try and get a similar conversation around reforming the financial system from a sustainability perspective. So, all right, you might say, well, what's the implication of this? The first thing to note is that this is a comprehensive approach to integrating ESG and sustainability into financial markets. So it's going to affect multiple aspects of the way you operate, and they include changes on fiduciary duty. So actual legislated changes that clarify that sustainability and ESG issues are part of the primary duty of care. There is draft legislation in front of the member states in Europe, which is being discussed now for potential passage early in 2019 that make it explicit. So this is how fundamental it is. Second thing, disclosure obligations and financial product implications. If you make a claim in future that you take sustainability seriously, you will be expected to disclose in your product statements and disclosures to beneficiaries how you do that. And so there's the process part about ESG, a lot of the things we've been doing for a long time, but there are additional obligations that if you say a particular investment option has green or sustainable or social characteristics, you'll be expected to disclose against a list of industries and economic activities which are green or sustainable or socially friendly, and say how your underlying investments relate to that list of activities. Now, one of the chairs of one of the Dutch funds, and you all know the Dutch funds are quite ambitious on sustainability, said, because I sit on this H-League panel and on some of the European advisory groups, he said, Nathan, just make sure you don't take the fun out of this when it comes to sustainability. And he was right. There is a risk that there's an over-regulation. We'll try and make sure that doesn't occur. But the point is, there is a clear direction of travel here. So these issues are coming into the regulatory regime, and the implication is that you can't just have an aspiration anymore. It needs to be driven through the fund much more comprehensively. So it'll affect your disclosures, it'll affect your beneficiary dialogue, it'll affect your investment activities in terms of how you actually try to find sustainable investment options in your offerings to members. And of course, it will affect your manager selection and actually understanding what your managers do, because no longer will you be in a position to just make a claim about sustainability. You'll actually have to know that some of the capital's flowing to sustainable ends in the real economy. So this is a pretty significant shift. Clearly, we're not going to get that kind of change in Australia right now. But for funds with operations in Europe, they will be captured in this regulatory change. And as I say, we are seeing this reform go through other parts of the market. I won't read through the slide, but I can provide it later. The point to note is that this is a comprehensive view about how the financial system functions. It's not just a 1 or 2 point intervention. So to give you an example, they're the stated goals of the policy action plan in Europe: reorient capital flows towards sustainable investment in order to achieve sustainable and inclusive growth, mainstreaming into risk management, and fostering transparency and long-termism. So these are fundamental reforms of financial market function. And the goal that sits behind that is the view that there needs to be around about 200 billion additional euros of financial flows every year to meet goals like the Paris Climate Agreement and the commitments of the EU under the Sustainable Development Goals. All right, so stand by, you'll see more on that in coming months. I just wanted to give you a list of changes they're actually making. So classification system for what's sustainable, standards and labels for green financial products, some incentives, number 3. Number 4, if you provide investment advice and the client expresses an interest in sustainability, you have to be able to describe how the products they're investing in, an advisor does, describe how the products they're investing in fulfills those sustainability obligations. And so this is clearly a light year shift from the kind of financial advice regime we've got at the moment. And the list goes on. So this is part of a wider trend. We've studied regulation on sustainability and responsible investment in 50 countries. You can see by the size of the dots where most of the change is coming from, but this is really the killer chart. This is the pace of change in regulation on responsible investment and sustainability. We've since studied 2017 and the curve still goes the same direction. So the point is that the regulators are now in this game and the environment is going to shift. So you need to think about reputation as a way that you respond and protect yourself, but obviously there's a more fundamental question about how you bring, when you own the world, what do you do with it, to bring these sustainability issues into the core of the thinking. Now, PRI, I think you all know PRI. No doubt most of you are signatories, which is fantastic. You're in good company globally. We still get 10 new signatories a week, over 2,000 signatories now, getting up to $80 trillion of assets under management globally participating. What does this tell us? It tells us that the market as a whole thinks there's value in this concept. The direction of travel seems quite clear. Something that we've changed in the last year is, we've got this reporting and assessment framework which gives everyone a lot of headaches every year because it's hard to complete and extensive. But we've actually set up a tool whereby asset owners can get the scores and the reporting of their managers on how they incorporate ESG factors into their processes. And so if you're a manager, no longer can you give flaky answers to these questions because your clients, you are going to be assessing and benchmarking the responses on how managers are responding. Yet another example of how the rubber is starting to hit the road on these issues. And the words you used to write on a page because you thought you needed to have a good positioning on this issue is not nearly substantial enough anymore. Okay, so just one other quick mention of a change. And again, it's I think, I live in the UK now where PRI is based, and of course we see the media about the political discussion here, which I know everyone thinks is terrible on these issues, climate and other sustainability questions. But it's really not like that in a lot of other countries. These are not politically sensitive questions in most countries. The Japanese struggle a bit. We know the Americans federally struggle a bit, but the East and the West Coast states, it's not politically contentious. In fact, there's widespread support for sustainability reforms. So as a reflection of that, when the G20 gets together, they have a conversation on sustainability and how they're going to incorporate these issues into national policy frameworks. It's really only the Americans and the Saudis who are not comfortable. Everyone else has a conversation around how they can advance the international monetary regime and international financial standards. And an example of this is the Financial Stability Board approach on climate change with the TCFD framework and the central banks that sit behind that. There's actually a high level of comfort with advancing the regulatory regime and the incentives globally to help investors find more sustainable investments. So we see this at the G20, we see this at the World Bank. The central banks globally have just launched a new network for greening the financial system. Who would have thought that would have happened only 2 or 3 years ago? So this is central bankers talking about how they can green the financial system. So again, it's just an example of how something much more fundamental is going on. So you might ask, okay, if there is something transformational going on around owning the world and sustainability, and therefore it's going to affect our core duty, the way we talk to our beneficiaries, our product disclosure, our risk management, the way we select and appoint managers, the list goes on. What do you do if you're a group of trustees or a board? So some of the funds globally, the usual suspects, the Nordics, the Dutch, some of the French, the UK insurers, there's a cohort of about 30 or 40 large asset owners globally that are driving these changes, and they've invested quite a lot at board level in understanding what their framework is for decision-making on sustainability. So I think that's the core question. If you're a board, how explicit is your dialogue at the board level about what you're going to do on these issues? Have you got some common understanding of the principles? Have you got some understanding of how far these issues will reach? Have you set some clear direction for the fund about how these should be incorporated? So I said 30 or 40 leaders globally. I didn't mention Aussie funds, but Aussie funds are clearly in the leading group. And this community is at the heart of that. We're one of the centres of excellence globally. But there's still a lot of funds that struggle. So PRI's done a few things. We've set up an online training course specifically for trustees on sustainability. It's a 3-hour course that can give you a good understanding of how to approach these questions. We're implementing a new program called Trustee Readiness for a Sustainable System, and it focuses on the trustee board dialogue on sustainability, considering what the views of the group are, considering the explicit decision-making frameworks, considering how you're going to deal with some of the complexities you'll face moving into this environment, which then sets a base to deal with the reputational issues. And so actually that's just been piloted, that program, and we hope to be running it out next year. Maybe a bit before that if we go well, but it's had a very positive support from funds that are not in that leading cohort of 30 to 40 globally, but know that they need to do something more comprehensive. And then I guess the last thing to say is that, to me at least, this changes the way we think about our beneficiary and member dialogue and engagement. So I'm always mindful, because I've not been a fund comms person, and I've not had to deal with this issue directly myself, but I've observed it for a long time in Australia, mainly my previous role at IGCC. We know that there's a difficult conversation around engaging members and beneficiaries if they're younger on these issues. But this gives us an opportunity for a depth of dialogue on issues that they care about that we've not ever really had. We know, we're going to have a whole presentation on it in a moment, so I won't go too much into it, but sustainability issues and what to do with the world is what they care about. They probably care about it more than their retirement benefits. So if we can link these two concepts together, we've actually got a very solid basis for a dialogue with our beneficiaries. And I think that if you look at, again, some of the Dutch funds, the way they're shifting the way they think about beneficiary engagement and dialogue, they're getting a very rich discussion about how the fund should operate. And that is an excellent premise on which to start to deal with your reputational risks and issues. So I'll leave it there. Thanks, it's been very good to talk to you.
Now we'll welcome Ashley.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. It's my privilege to be here with you this morning. As was introduced, my name is Ashley Fell. I'm the Head of Communications at an organisation called McCrindle Research, and we consider ourselves to be a research-based communications agency. So we conduct a lot of focus groups, a lot of surveys with customers and consumers from a variety of different organisations and sectors. And then another part of my role particularly is communicating those insights and that data. And I guess for me, my passion and a passion of ours at McCrindle is to help organisations and sectors think about some of the external trends that are impacting them. I'm sure as professionals in the superannuation industry, you know the trends that are impacting, the internal trends that are impacting your organisation. And today my time here with you is going to be focused on taking a look at one particular external trend that is impacting this sector, which is the generational change, and how different, particularly the emerging generations, approach the topic of superannuation, engaging with different organisations in this space. And as was introduced, I am often described as a social researcher or a futurist or a demographer. And I guess, as I mentioned, you know, we at McCrindle, we love poring over data sets. We conduct a lot of surveys. We consistently, almost every day, are looking at the ABS, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and this next slide really sums up who we are at McCrindle and what we love. We love data, we love the demographics, we love the census. You know, I know a lot of Australians focused on the hashtag census fail, but for us, we had a cake the day the results were released. It was very exciting. It's an exciting life we lead as demographers. But I guess for us, we really do believe that there is power in data and power in the story that the data can tell for different organisations. And as I said, you know, often I am introduced as a futurist, and I wanted to just take a moment, if we're thinking about the future, if we're thinking about engaging with these emerging generations, if we think about this iconic year of 2020, did anybody else feel like that was a really futuristic, far-off year? And now here we are, sitting in the middle of 2018, less than 18 months away from hitting this iconic milestone. And I think it's important to think about some of the changes that our world has seen in the time since this decade began, since the year 2010. And I thought, what better way to think about that if we are talking about the emerging generations than to think about some of the viral trends and memes that we've seen come and go in that time. I mean, if you think back to the year 2010 or 2011, you might recall that viral trend of photobombing where you tried to get in the back of someone's photo and photobomb it. Our current theory is that that may have actually originated by accident, obviously unverified there. Moving through the decade after photobombing, we had planking. I don't know why, but we decided we needed to lie down on things and take photos of ourselves doing so. Again, our current theory is that that may have actually originated by accident. After planking, we had things like Gangnam Style, and if I said to you there was a viral app of this decade, just turn to the person next to you for a moment and say to them what app you think I'd be talking about. The viral app of this decade that had some of the quickest uptake of all the apps we've seen come and go. Not a lot of people get this correct, because the app I am talking about is Pokemon Go. And I think at the time it was the uptake of it, this idea of augmented reality, and now I don't know anybody who engages with this anymore. That's how quickly our world is changing. And if you parent any young people or engage with them on a regular basis, you might know that more recently what the app we've seen, or not the app, sorry, but the dance move that seems to be of the time is, of course, the floss dance. And I'm sure you can, and I think we can all rest assured, because the first thing that comes up in Google when you type in floss dance is a parent's guide. So I think if we take nothing else away, we can rest assured that this does exist on the internet. But I guess this is just a short, fun way to introduce this concept of change and how much our world and our generations and the way we engage with brands and organisations in different sectors is changing. And we often say that once upon a time, you know, change might have looked something like this. Whereas today, the world that we're living in, the different changes that are taking place, it seems to feel and look a little bit more like this, whereby there's lots of trends taking place and converging and happening at the same time, which is meaning that organisations need to be quick to respond to these changes to remain relevant. And I guess for us as social researchers, doing the analysis, doing the focus groups and the surveys, we've identified a common response to this concept of change. It's called change fatigue, whereby you might acknowledge that change is taking place in the world around you, but you become a bit overwhelmed or fatigued by it. Kind of like this grandmother here who had their grandchild help them with the remote control and having the problem of too many buttons. Now, I commend the innovation displayed by this young young grandchild. But I guess for us, it's important to identify that and for us, our passion is helping organisations understand some of these changes, particularly the external trends, so that we can be responsive to change and not fatigued or overwhelmed by it. And for us, if we had to sum up the changes our world is seeing in one sentence, it goes something like this. We say it's only occasionally in history that massive demographic shifts combined with rapid social change and huge generational transitions, as well as ongoing technology trends, so that within the span of a decade, society altogether alters. And today, in the short time I have to speak to you, I'm going to focus particularly on this idea of generational transitions and how our emerging generations are engaging with this industry of superannuation. Today in Australia we have 6 generations, or in our world we have 6 generations, and I think each of you might have been given one of these infographic cards in your delegate bags, and it gives you a bit of an overview of the 6 generations that we do have in Australia. We've got our oldest generation, our builders, right through to our Gen Ys and our Gen Zs, who are our millennials, and then our Generation Alphas. We actually named that Generation Alpha a few years ago when we had come to the end of the alphabet with Gen Z. We surveyed Australians and we said, what do you think the next generation should be called? Now, naturally, a lot of them said Generation A because we've come to the end of the alphabet with Gen Z. But what we thought was, let's name them Generation Alpha. Let's move to the Greek alphabet to signify this whole new world in which this generation will be shaped. Born since the year 2010, the same year the first generation iPad was released. So they'll only ever know a world of iPads. And I don't parent any Gen Alphas yet, but I'm an auntie to 2 little ones, and I love hanging out with them. And when we're together, it's interesting to see them walk up to the TV screen and just expect it to be a touch screen. You and I, glass was something we were told to keep our hands off, whereas for them it's the medium in which they engage and learn and connect. So it's fascinating. Now, particularly I want to focus on today the millennials. I don't know what your experience is with the millennials. Maybe you feel a little bit like this, millennials everywhere. Or perhaps your perception of the millennials is along the lines of this. You think that they're just about sharing their meals on Instagram and Facebook and sharing their life with their friends, which is true. It's fascinating when you type something into Google these days, it can automate for you or suggest a few common responses. When you type in millennials are, it's a fascinating exercise. This is what comes up. Millennials are lazy, killing, stupid, what age? And I am a millennial, self-confessed millennial, so it is a little bit of a bad rap that we get sometimes. But I guess to help us understand them, well, who are the millennials? For us, we know as generational experts that they're a hybrid of Gen Y and Gen Z. So basically, we're looking at a hybrid of these generations. They're born between the years of 1980 and the year 2000, aged around 18 to 37 years of age. And particularly, I guess, what defines them is that they're coming of age in the new millennium. So that is what defines them. Now, before I get into, I guess, some of the trends and the things that we know about them and that we need to keep in mind when we're thinking about engaging with them, I think it's important that if they are our future customers and we're looking to engage with them, that we understand one crucial thing about them. And if you parent or lead or employ them or just engage with them in different contexts, you might know that particularly our Generation Zs, our school students of today, those who are aged 9 to 23, they tend to speak a different language. Have you noticed? We call it slanguage. It's this idea that it's text speak, but it's used verbally, in verbal communication. And so what I've done is I've created a bit of an example of a phrase that you might hear come out of the mouth of a Gen Z. And I think it's important that we understand them. So this is something you might hear from them. They might say, "Bae, my new gig is legit, the hours are savage, YOLO." Now, this is English, and I think it's important that together we understand what this young person is trying to say if we're looking to engage with them and communicate with them. So BAE stands for, it's this idea that it's someone important to you. It's actually an acronym, I'm not sure if you know, and it actually stands for before anyone else. So it can mean a significant other or a partner or a best friend. Work gig is kind of talking about their job. It's legit, it's happening, it's current. The hours are savage, they're really intense. And then YOLO stands for you only live once. Now, perhaps a response from a Gen Z to this phrase might be, "Yas queen, slay girl, goat." Now, again, it's important that we understand what these current language means. So Yas Queen is like, yeah, you go girl, great job. Slay, again, killing it, doing something really well. And then GOAT, it's actually an acronym, stands for greatest of all time. So if you get referred to as a GOAT by a young person, it's a compliment of the highest order. So just keep that in mind. But really, sometimes they do take a while to get to the point, because all this conversation is tailing is, I like my job. Well, great. But it is important that we understand and engage with them, because currently, Generation Z comprise 9% of our workforce, just 1 in 10 workers. But by 2025, which is less than a decade away now, they'll comprise 1/3 of our workforce. And if we combine those Gen Ys and those Gen Zs, they'll comprise 2/3 of our workforce. So certainly coming through in big numbers. And I guess what I want to share with you in the short time I have left with you is just 5 key characteristics that we know about this emerging generation. And it's important to keep in mind when we are thinking about engaging with them, particularly with regards to superannuation, which from a few of the reports I've read lately, it does seem like this generation aren't as engaged with this sector. Again, it's this idea that they're more short-term immediate needs rather than thinking about their retirement. So it's important, though, that we do engage with them. So the first trend I just want to share with you that we know about this generation is that they're a very digital generation. So very technologically integrated, a very informed generation through their digital devices. And in less connected times, different global issues that now are of utter importance wouldn't have got as much traction as they have today because of these digital devices that we carry around with us. We say that we're living in what we call the great screen age. And the reason we say that is because there's this idea that there's this multi-screening, this multi-screening that happens in your home. You probably do it. I do it all the time. We're spending more time on our screen-based devices. We're increasingly digitally connected. There was a study that was conducted in 2009, and it pinpointed the year 1997 as the year that we spent more time on electronic media than face-to-face interaction. So increasingly engaging with brands and organisations and friends and networks through our digital devices. So we know that this generation are very digital, and there's this crazy stat that there's actually 7 times the amount of electronic devices out there than there are people on this planet, which is astounding. So a very digital generation. Secondly, a very globally connected generation. So the trends, the Netflix movies and the trends and the memes that impact generations are very global, and they're the same or similar across different countries and aren't dependent on geographical location. We are dealing with a generation who engage with different global NGOs and organisations, and there's very transparent. They're expecting increasing transparency with regards to that. These global connections and transformations have transformed how this generation engage with brands and different sectors. So global are we, so digitally connected, that this photo here, I'll just explain to you, is taken outside the historic location of the Sistine Chapel in the year 2005. It's people gathering for the inauguration of Pope Benedict. There's just one small Nokia phone in the bottom right-hand corner. Fast forward 8 years later to the year 2013. How different do you think this image would look? Taken in the same historic location, but people gathering for the inauguration of Pope Francis. Well, yes, very different in fact. So increasingly, we're globally connected. We're sharing different events with our global audiences that can transcend borders. Another key defining trait that we know about these emerging generations is that they're an increasingly mobile generation, particularly when it comes to their career. You know, you or I, our career trajectory might have looked something like this. You go through high school and then on to further education or study and then into your chosen profession. Today, the career trajectory of a young person looks a little bit more like this, whereby there's more options available to them and at their disposal, and the option to study and travel and upskill and retrain. We know that Generation Z are a more formally educated generation. You know, 1 in 4 Gen Xers went to university compared to 1 in 3 Gen Ys, and it's predicted that 1 in 2 Gen Zs will obtain a higher education degree or further study. So we know that they're more formally educated, and based on the average tenure of 3 years and 4 months, it's predicted they'll have 17 jobs across 5 careers in their lifetime. So constantly changing, and it's interesting when we think about the future of work and what that will look like with digital disruption. So quite a well-equipped generation for the future. The only thing it seems that Generation Z aren't moving more frequently is out of the family home. Now, if you parent any of this generation, you might know that. We're staying at home longer, rising living costs, further study, and that's why Generation Z and Generation Y are also labelled the kippers, which stands for kids in parents' pockets eroding retirement savings. In addition to being global and digital and mobile, we know that Generation Z are a visual generation. They respond to visual communication far better than the written form of old. And because of this, our three biggest fears of our emerging generations now are no longer snakes, spiders and heights, but we would say the biggest fear of this generation would have to be low Wi-Fi, whereby they can't connect to their digital or global audience. Further than that, the buffering circle is cause for great concern. And along this trajectory of scary symbols, the scariest of them all would have to be low battery, whereby all forms of connectivity cease to exist. In addition to being visual and global and digital, we know that they're also a very social generation. So the networks that impact them are far larger than have been in the past. And it's so social are they that signs like these need to be installed in places like this. In case of fire, exit building before Instagramming about it. So they're 5 key things that we know about this emerging generation that are important to keep in mind when we're thinking about engaging with them. And I guess particularly one area that I just want to touch on very briefly is this idea that the millennials, are very keen to engage with organisations and super funds that have purpose. And for us, this is this idea that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, for survival and security for them, while still important, it used to be about what's the insurance, am I comfortable with the risk investment, does it perform well? But more than that, what Generation Y and Z are interested in as the social aspects. Is this super fun for me? Do I identify with them? Will this make me look good? And even more than that, those self-actualisation and self-esteem topics around what's the social contribution, what about the environmental considerations, what investments am I looking at allocating my money to? So it's interesting, this idea that we're changing, and of course the basic need for this emerging generation would have to be Wi-Fi. So if that exists, we know it's going to be okay. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an overview of some of the defining characteristics and traits of this emerging generation. I just want to leave you with 4 R's that we've identified that organisations need to keep in mind when thinking about engaging with this emerging generation. The first R is to be real. And I guess for us, it's about organisations that are real and authentic and transparent. And there's this great quote from a report I read recently which said, people are looking for a more complete picture of a company's performance, which includes not only financial performance, but also environmental, social and ethical performance. And even in the workplace, the emerging generations respond to leaders who lead with integrity and whose actions support what they preach, not like this person here whose obviously actions were completely contradictory to the message. So it's important to be real. Secondly, it's important to be relevant. And this report that I was reading about millennials engaging with superannuation, there were 4 key takeaways. The first was making superannuation tangible for millennials. The second was helping them to be informed and advised, because there is this lack of awareness or understanding about superannuation when it comes to the emerging generations. The third, which is really key, is to be transparent and easy to deal with. And the fourth, which is really relevant to our discussion today, is to appealing to what's important to millennials, that those ethical, social, environmental considerations around their investments. And it is important to remain relevant in our communication as well. Kind of not like this sign here, which now, because LOL, it used to read if you see someone drowning, call 911. Now it reads if you see someone drowning, LOL. And LOL means laugh out loud. So now this sign's meaning has completely changed and it's now irrelevant. So making sure we remain real, relevant, responsive to this idea that these emerging generations are looking for increasing transparency with the organisations that they're engaged with, relevance, immediacy and personalisation. And again, another quote from that report I was reading, increasing engagement, superannuation should be tangible, demystified, transparent and better aligned with millennials' values. And then lastly, I guess this idea around responsiveness. Hopefully you work in an engaging workplace where you're not scared about your lunch being stolen, but if you are, you might take a leaf out of this young person's book who identified a problem in their environment. Their lunch was getting stolen in the communal fridge. So what they did was they created an anti-theft lunch bag. So when the sandwich was in the bag, it was safe from being stolen. So making sure we remain relevant and innovative in our solutions. And lastly, to be relational. And probably this is one of the key ones with regards to our panel discussion today around engaging not just with the facts and the data, but the story and in the marketing and how we communicate to these emerging generation. And a great quote from that report, Millennials' Engagement with Superannuation reads, "Greater transparency is important to generating trust, but information needs to be delivered in a way which is personalised, and technology can facilitate this. It may not be realistic to expect that millennials will feel completely comfortable with the complexity, constant changes and details of regulation in this space, but the goal should be to ensure that young people are not suspicious about their superannuation." And for us, we often have this saying with our research and with our data, it's about not just engaging with the eyes of the head, but with the eyes of the heart as well, and emotion and relating to millennials in that way. So thank you very much for listening. Look forward to the panel discussion that we'll have next. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashley. And as Michael's going up, a just reminder that please feel free to send in some questions. We've already got some good ones, but now please welcome Michael.
Thanks, Mike. Ashley, that presentation was really lit. I learnt last week from my first 14-year-old that lit means hot, on fire, really, really good. I've got 2 Gen Zs at home and 3 alphas, so all I know is that I'm screwed. But one thing I do know of my Gen Zs and my alphas is that reputation matters, and the American president is about at the bottom of that reputation order for them. I woke up with a fright the other morning. My son, my 5-year-old, came into my bedroom at about 5:30 in the morning with a book in his hand and said, "Dad, I want you to read me the story about Donald Trump." And I turned to him and I said, "Mate, what are you talking about?" Now, for Easter last year, we bought him a book called Donald Loves Drumming. It's a book about a rhinoceros that loves making a lot of noise, and he has trouble finding a place where he can go and make noise where people don't rouse on him. I woke up with a start thinking, what the hell has my son gotten hold of? Anyway, all I know is I'm in trouble, but reputation matters. My role is Head of Corporate Affairs for First State Super. So to give a little bit of a context for those that don't know First State Super so well, we are one of the country's largest profit for member financial service organisations. We manage approximately $91 billion in retirement savings on behalf of our members, providing superannuation services and financial advice. Many of our members work in vocational roles that care for our communities. They are nurses, they're midwives, they're teachers, they're coppers, they're fireys. Our members belong to some of the most trusted professions in the community, and that's an important sentiment that we'll come back to. Our members are central to our organisational culture, and we see it as our responsibility, our privilege to help our members to plan for their retirement, the retirement they deserve, the retirement that they want. I joined First State Super in 2015, a little over 3 years ago, in a new role of Head of Corporate Affairs. Hadn't previously existed. When I came in, there was a part-time officer looking after broad corporate affairs related matters and pulling together a media clippings list. We now have a team of 6. I have 2 colleagues in Melbourne and 4 working with me in Sydney. I see my role, 3 Ps, to position, to protect and to promote First State Super. I've never previously worked inside an organisation that places such a high degree of importance on 2 things, relationships and trust. First State Super is quite unique in that regard. It comes from our CEO, it comes from our chairman, and it resonates throughout the organisation. So for someone in my position as Head of Corporate Affairs, it's really difficult to imagine a better place to work. I consider myself very fortunate, but we don't always get it right. However, we do learn. And today I'll share, so much time as we've got, some of those learnings and experiences with you. So central to our reputation is this notion of trust. We want to be worthy of our members' trust, and that idea frames our approach to investing. We want to be proud of the investments that we make, and we want those investments to deliver sustainable long-term returns to our members and, subject to our fiduciary duties, to deliver tangible benefits to the communities in which our members live, work and retire. And we're very conscious of the footprints of that our investments make in markets, in the communities and broadly in the environment. These factors directly impact reputation, and they are assessed and weighed very carefully through our investment process. Mike started out with a quote from Sam around the principle of universal ownership, and universal ownership is at the core of our investment approach. We recognise there can be second-order and third-order implications and outcomes from the investment decisions that we make, implications for our members and implications for the world into which they will retire. And it follows that we should seek to assess the socio-economic externalities of all of our investment activities with the goal of skewing over time our investments to having a net positive impact. We believe that this will deliver strong, long-term risk-adjusted return premiums. And by relating such externalities back to risk and return, the principle of universal ownership kind of sums up the obligations we have to our members and to the broader social community as well. So the consideration of reputational risk forms part of the due diligence of the investment decisions that we make. A member of the investment team reviews and assesses the risk factors, and these findings influence the risk-adjusted return estimates that are discussed at the Management Investment Committee, at the Investment Committee, and at a board level as well within the fund. We consider our exposure to reputational risk in the same way that we consider other key risks: customer risk, industry-style risk, disruption risk, ESG risks, and other things. And all these risks inform what the potential long-term earnings of an investment is likely to be. We consider reputational risk across two levels, both market factors and non-market factors. So the market-related or Tier 1 factors include failure to deliver the appropriate risk-adjusted return, liquidity risk, infrastructure risk, property, credit risk, that type of thing. The non-market-related or Tier 2 factors include investment governance, investment operations risk, counterparty risk, ESG risks, etc. And we're very conscious that if the organisation we invest in loses its social licence to operate, then we all lose. So we need to assess the reputation risks, estimate the likely impact of those risks at the outset, and we need to regularly monitor emerging reputational risks throughout the life of the investment. We also try to consider investment opportunities through the lens of our members and our stakeholders. We have a dedicated exposure to impact investments, which involves proactively sourcing and investing in compelling investments that provide a very strong and clear positive social economic output or benefit. Examples are renewable energy or venture capital or social bonds or social and affordable housing. We know these things matter to our members and many of our stakeholders, and we want to invest in a way that matters. Tobacco is a similar example. Many of our members, as I mentioned, work in the healthcare sector. They are acutely aware of the negative impacts of tobacco use on our community, and so our members' expectations were an important consideration in our decision to divest from tobacco a number of years ago. So even with the best corporate affairs manager around, we don't always get things right. Occasionally, we get blindsided. We discover that our stakeholders don't respond in the way that we thought they would, either because we've failed to communicate with them or we've failed to frame their expectations, or we've failed to thoroughly consider all of the consequences that our investment decisions have on them, our stakeholders. And occasionally, it's the whole kit and caboodle, the lot. An example of this would be our investment in New South Wales land titles. So in 2017, a little over a year ago, we invested in New South Wales land titles, a formerly government-owned and operated service. It was our view that our investment in New South Wales Land and Property Information, or LPI, would provide a long-term sustainable return to our members. The LPI service was a pivotal part of the New South Wales economy, utilised by many people within the community, and the investment was consistent with our approach to invest into the communities where our members are living, working and retiring. It was our intention to work very collaboratively with the existing management and staff of the LPI to build on LPI's well-established reputation and continue to provide reliable services to the people of New South Wales. It was a very competitive bid process, but we felt very self-satisfied that we were the preferred bidder for everyone. For a start, we weren't a big investment bank. We didn't have a whole lot of international interests playing in. Nothing was being offshored. We were homegrown. We were known. We were trusted. We were the super fund for a lot of the people working at the LPI. And the staff of the LPI, as I said, were members, and there were promises in place to ensure that they would keep their jobs. So what could go wrong? Well, what went wrong was that we failed to thoroughly consider our stakeholder, the Public Service Association, an organisation with whom we had had a long and valued and trusted relationship, an organisation that was appropriately concerned about the rights and the security and the working conditions of its members. The PSA was witnessing another government-run asset being passed off to a private operator under a concession arrangement, and they were understandably concerned, and we had not directly consulted with them. The pushback was immediate, the pushback was hard, and it was felt. Now, the relationship with the PSA recovered after a period of time, and the PSA has acknowledged that as a concession holder we have fulfilled the promises that we initially made to employees around providing job security. We learned from that experience, and as a result we established a set of stakeholder engagement principles that are on our website now that outline the process through which we will engage with stakeholders and other interested parties in relation to the investments that we make. A couple of weeks ago, we were successful in securing the concession to run the Victorian Land Titles Office. The day of the announcement, we met with the employees of the organisation. Immediately after that, we met with their representative organisation, the CPSU, to outline and explain our intentions and engage with them in the process, and we will continue to do that over the coming months. I mentioned before that we want to be proud of the investments that we make on behalf of our members. Examples of that are our investment in the Bendigo Hospital, the Sunshine Coast University Hospital, the International Convention Centre Sydney, Bankstown Camden Airports, almond farms along the Murray River are a few examples of that. But it's not always easy because, like many of you, we invest in industries that can be challenging. Where we do, we want to be investing in organisations that are the best operator. Our investment in Oak Tree Retirement Villages was a case there. About a year ago, we made our first investment into the retirement accommodation or retirement village sector. Just as we made that investment in Oak Tree Retirement Villages, a listed retirement village operator called Avio, you may remember, hit the headlines for overcharging and underservicing residents, and it seemed to open up a Pandora's box of issues of other providers overcharging residents and underservicing residents. They were being ripped off, accommodation was substandard, and they were being charged the earth for it. It was a really unfortunate timing. Clearly, we can't always control that. So we made the decision to delay the announcement of our investment somewhat. But we were really excited to tell the story because we were trying to, again, invest in the best operator and raise industry standards more broadly. And because there's such a strong alignment between what we're trying to achieve and the retirement we're trying to help our members achieve, and the quality and range and diversity of retirement accommodation that's available for them. So sometimes timing can work against you and there can be reputational implications, but in that instance it also provided an opportunity for us to demonstrate a point of difference from the market. Go New South Wales is another interesting example that I'll share with you. So even our best intentions sometimes in the impact investing space can be a challenge from a reputational perspective. In February of this year, we announced our investment in the Go New South Wales Fund, an impact investment where we've partnered with the New South Wales government to provide capital to high-growth companies in exchange for a percentage of ownership. So essentially, First State Super kicks in $100 million. New South Wales government kick in about $50 million into the fund. At least 20% of that will be invested into regional businesses that have a valuation of between 20 and 50 million, so they're well established, but are about to embark on a significant expansion, creating jobs, as many as 2,500 jobs over the lifetime of that investment. Our first investment opportunity was in a company called Stone Axe, who have established a base in northern New South Wales in the beautiful country town called Ebor, where they are breeding and exporting Wagyu beef to international markets. So again, a great opportunity to create economic prosperity, growth and jobs for a regional community that can do with all the help it can get. The second investment was in an oyster producer in Narooma on the south coast of New South Wales. The investment reflected our approach to investing in the communities where our members live, work and retire. The oyster producer was going to use the capital to, or will use the capital to acquire new leases and increase productivity, improve infrastructure, all of which creating new jobs and growth for the region. So it's good news for our members, it's good news for regional communities, it's good news for jobs, it's good news for the economy, tick, tick, tick. But if you've been reading the papers, just in the last couple of days, the New South Wales government and our sponsoring body of this fund, Jobs for New South Wales, has come under fire in Parliament, in New South Wales Parliament, and in the media for arguably not demonstrating sufficient transparency in the process. So again, we're in the middle of managing reputational challenges. It's a great investment, there's great outcomes, but it seems more consultation was expected. So quickly summing up, 3 things. Trust is our greatest asset. We treasure it, and we work really, really hard to hang on to it. Secondly, for us, the calculation of reputation risk is fundamental to our investment process. Understanding reputational risks associated with a particular investment helps us to forecast what the risk-adjusted return stream is going to look like. And thirdly, consider your investment decisions through the eyes of your stakeholders and communicate, communicate, communicate. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you, Michael, particularly for sharing some live examples there. We don't have much time, I think, for questions, but maybe we can go over time a bit. But there's a great question here from Chris Bryant, which is, young people and activists seem to want screens, in other words, divestment, rather than engagement. So are there any good examples of successes that you've seen in communicating the benefits of company engagement? Perhaps Nathan and then Michael and then Ashley jump in as well.
Yes. Why would a customer of any kind, a beneficiary, a member, ask you not to do something you're going to do? I think is the fundamental question. Why are they asking you to divest something or take something out of a portfolio? It's because they don't think you're going to make that judgment on their behalf on an issue they care about. So if your response to an underlying environmental or social challenge is that you will engage, they need to understand what the consequence or outcome of that engagement process might be. If we just talk process language around an outcome they care about, they're not going to get it. So engagement can work. In fact, only some problems will be tractable by engagement because you can't allocate away from some of the problems we've got. So collaborative, active ownership issues are essential, but we need a much better way about thinking about where they're going to lead and how we communicate about them.
Mm-hmm. Michael?
Yeah, look, we are proudly an active owner. It's early days for us, so there's probably no specific examples I can share with you, but one thing we are very conscious of for us, issues of diversity, issues of remuneration practices are really important within the organisation, and we, as we're engaging with some of these owners and investments and boards and looking to hold them to account, we're also very conscious of the implications for us. You know, we don't want to be seen as being hypocritical, so we are very conscious of the practices of the organisations in which we're investing, and we're trying to live up to those standards internally as well. But active engagement is something we are very conscious of and something we are increasingly doing.
Mm-hmm. Ashley?
The only addition I have was to, I guess, second Nathan's point about communicating about the outcomes, particularly with the emerging generations, and that transparency around that is what we've seen that they are looking for.
Mm-hmm. And just very little time left. Nathan, I'd like your discussion about the sort of regulatory changes coming internationally.
Yeah.
Could you share some of what's happening in Australia with the audience that may not be aware of it?
Yes. So I think the interesting thing that I'm observing is that there is a shift in the mood at APRA, it appears to me. In fact, we're talking this afternoon about their understanding of the reform process globally. In fact, the chairman of APRA yesterday gave a speech commenting on the fact that the Australian investment market had become so focused on numbers that they'd forgotten how to understand and interpret reputation. The implication being is that we've lost a lot of the focus on the audience. I don't think he's not talking about this room particularly. It's a broader context, but we're still subject to some of the same practices in the investment markets that make it harder, this short-termism, this financial focus that is essential but not the only part of the equation. And so we've lost some of the capacity to understand reputation, to understand dialogue with our members, and we're not set up to do it so well anymore, and in fact we must reform that. And so this is APRA talking. So they as well, I think, are getting the message that there's something more fundamental in terms of a shift required.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so unfortunately we're out of time, but just want to remind you all to rate the session and provide any feedback via the app. And could you please join me in thanking the three fantastic speakers.